Man, I talk a lot about games based on movies. It is hard not to when you are so passionate about both mediums. I grew up a big movie buff, and as you all know, really into the Nintendo Entertainment System. I rented and played a lot of movie-based games on the NES. More often than not, they were a huge letdown. What I didn't know was that there was an alternative that early in the console's life wasn't just offering movie-based games, but offering awesome movie-based games. The only problem was that I never got my Sega Genesis until 1994, and I completely missed some of these until later in life, when I got into retro collecting and found them and thought back in the time I could have spent enjoying great versions of these titles during their heyday. I'm MichaelBtheGameGenie, and today on Video Game Nostalgia, we're going to be taking a look back at bad movie games on the NES that were great on the Genesis.
Goodbye.
I was such a huge fan of Dick Tracy as a kid, and it should come as no surprise that I was supremely let down by the NES game. It falls into that typical trope of not being straightforward. It was really complicated because you had to identify where to go based on the information presented to you, and I could never understand that as a kid. I would just get in my car and drive around, all the while being shot at by sprites so tiny that it was impossible to identify them on a 13-inch TV. I would eventually find a blinking location and head in, only quickly to die, as I had exhausted all of my life being shot while driving around. Another extremely frustrating aspect was that when I shot people, I lost life too. Turns out you can only shoot individuals that are armed, so you have to constantly switch back and forth between punching and the gun. Also, am I in the right location? As a kid, who knew? So I would get frustrated and turn it off. Turns out that you were instructed to check your notepad and mugshots to identify your next location. Once you catch and interrogate the bad guy, it will lead you to the next clue. This game may be better than I'm giving it credit for, so I may come back to it at some point, but I still consider it to be poor. What I wasn't aware of was that there was also a Dick Tracy game released on the Genesis, and this one was not only straightforward, but provided the pulse-pounding action I was looking for. It took me a while to get used to the concept here because as soon as you start, it seems like a pretty slow-moving side-scrolling platformer, but there were these guys also moving in the background, who were shooting at me, and I was taking damage. Turns out this game is a really cool hybrid of a side-scrolling platformer and third-person shooter that keeps your pulse pounding. I really like using the Tommy gun to mow down the enemies in the background, and also watching the destruction it causes. The boss fights are also an interesting treat as the bosses will keep popping up in the background and you will need to focus on attacking them, all the while avoiding the enemies on the side-scrolling plane as well as the other enemies in the background. It's a fast and furious balancing act to take down the boss, but it feels so good when you finally do. I don't want to say too much more because I intend to do a full review on this game sometime in the future, but I will say that the driving stages are significantly better on the Genesis version. So much better. So, Ghostbusters on the NES kinda sucks. I know that there are some people out there that are big proponents of it, and maybe I'm missing the intricacies of it as a strategy game instead of your typical platformer, but I've always, and I mean always, had a hard time trying to find some fun here. You start out on this crude map as the Ghostbusters logo when you see a building blink. Cool, let's go bust some ghosts. Except it won't let you because you need to buy supplies, so move the logo up to the shop and then you do this weird driving sim before you can even shop. Once you have the equipment, head to the flashing building and now it's time to bust some ghosts. Nope, you have to do the weird driving sim again first, but after that you finally get to take down the ghost and it's really kinda lame. Then you keep doing this over and over until you run out of gas. I mean this both literally, as the car actually runs out of gas from time to time, and figuratively, as I never really die in this game but just get bored and turn it off. Ghostbusters on the Genesis is a different story altogether. I've actually done a full review on this game, so I won't go into too much detail here. You play as one of the 3 original Ghostbusters, all with different attributes. I always play as Peter as I find he is the most balanced. The trick here is that it is, get this, straightforward and a fun action platformer. You go from location to location and there are actual levels. Your blaster will take down the smaller ghosts, and when you hit a sub-boss, you have the opportunity to capture it. Heck yeah, now I'm busting some ghosts. Most importantly, the bosses and sub-bosses are really creative and fun here. Completely different from the NES version where they were just bland ghosts, but this fits more with the theme presented in the movies and cartoons. I love Ghostbusters on the Genesis and don't just think it's a great movie-based game, but a hidden gem on the system. So, Rambo on the NES is an interesting game to say the least. It's a side-scrolling action platformer, so it should be great, right? Well, it's a weird one. First off is that it uses multiple screens that you have to navigate by going north or south to progress, which has been an often mentioned problem with NES games that use this navigation tactic, and it is very easy to get lost. The second is explaining the combat. Well, it seems to be a weird cross of Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2, which are two games that I think are unfairly critiqued, but for some reason it just doesn't seem to work for me here in Rambo, and I'm getting more frustrated than I should be. This is Rambo. I want to blow away a pile of bad guys with my gun, maybe like in Commando. Why couldn't they just make the game like that? Well, they did on other systems. Take for example Rambo on the Sega Master System, which plays an awful lot like Commando, and definitely more along the lines of what I was hoping a Rambo game would be. I'm not saying this game is great because honestly, it is ridiculously hard for me. I mean ridiculously, and most of my games last less than a minute. Plus, this is great Genesis movie games, so moving on. I cheat a little here because this is Rambo 3 on the Genesis, so not tied directly to a specific movie, and more of a franchise overall. What's important is that this game is fantastic. It's a top-down run-and-gun game, and the focus here is on the action, and it comes fast and furious. You have a straight attack, which is your machine gun, which if you hold down on the attack button will spray a constant stream of bullets, which looks awesome and tears down all oncoming enemies in your path. You also have another attack which can be switched between a knife for close range combat, the iconic arrow, and last but not least, a time bomb, and these will all be applied to the game's combat appropriately. I fell in love with this game immediately when I got to the boss fight where I had to take down a helicopter with my bow and arrow. This is by far the most ridiculous thing I have ever seen in a game, or in a movie. Altogether an awesome experience and a movie-based game that I am proud to have in my collection. So guys, those were some bad movie games on the NES that were great on the Genesis. Are there any others that come to mind that I didn't mention? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, thank you for sharing in my video game nostalgia.